At a livestock auction in Timber Ridge, Wyoming, a rancher stood in torn boots while wealthy buyers sneered at his desperation. Jack Brennan had come to sell, not buy, but when a mud-caked horse nobody wanted stumbled into the ring, something made him raise his hand with his last $40. The crowd erupted in mockery. What they didn't know was that this forgotten animal carried a secret worth more than all their herds combined. This is the story of how humiliation turned to revelation, and how one man's leap of faith exposed a truth that would shake the entire valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through Carbon County like a knife through leather, carrying with it the smell of diesel fuel and livestock. Jack Brennan sat in his 20-year-old Ford pickup, its engine ticking as it cooled in the gravel parking lot of the Timber Ridge livestock auction. Through the cracked windshield, he could see men in clean Carhartt jackets and new Stetsons gathering near the entrance, their laughter rising above the sound of cattle lowing in the holding pens. Jack looked down at his own jacket, the one Beth had bought him 12 years ago, now held together at the elbow with duct tape. His jeans were clean but faded to the color of old sky, and his boots, once fine leather, were split along the side where the sole had begun to separate. He had not wanted to come. The auction barn held too many memories of better days when he and his brother Daniel would arrive in a clean truck with a trailer full of prime cattle, when other ranchers would nod with respect, when the Brennan name meant something in this valley. Now it meant debt. It meant foreclosure notices stuffed in the mailbox. It meant standing in line at the feed store while others whispered just loud enough for him to hear. Jack gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn plastic, and forced himself to breathe. He was here to sell Duchess, his last good-breeding mare, the only animal left on his ranch worth more than the cost of feeding her through winter. The decision had taken weeks to make, but the bank had given him no choice. Sell something of value or lose everything. Inside the auction barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. Wooden bleachers rose on either side of a dirt ring where animals were paraded under harsh fluorescent lights. Jack made his way to the back row, keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact. He recognized most of the faces here. Wade Garrett sat front and center, his silver belt buckle catching the light, his ostrich-skin boots crossed casually as he scrolled through his phone. Wade owned the largest spread in the county now, had expanded aggressively over the past 5 years, buying up land from families who couldn't hold on. He had made an offer on the Brennan ranch 3 times. Each time, Jack had refused. Beside Wade sat Vernon McKay, the auctioneer, a man whose voice could rattle rafters and whose loyalty went to whoever paid the highest commission. Vern had been a friend of Jack's father, but friendship meant little when money talked louder. Near the rail stood Frank Dalton, a retired rancher whose bitterness had calcified over years of watching the world change without asking his permission. Frank had once been Daniel's friend, but after the accident, after the whiskey-fueled argument about who was responsible, Frank had stopped speaking to Jack entirely. Now he only stared, his jaw working a piece of tobacco, his eyes hard as river stones. The auction began with the usual parade of cattle, calves, and a few sheep that drew lukewarm interest. Jack waited, his stomach tight, his hands clenched between his knees. Finally, Vern's voice boomed across the barn. Next up, we have a fine quarter-horse mare. 8 years old, good bloodlines, bred twice successfully. Let's bring her out. Duchess entered the ring with her head high, her chestnut coat gleaming even under the unflattering lights. Jack had spent an hour that morning brushing her, checking her hooves, making sure she looked her best. She was worth at least $3,000, maybe more to the right buyer. He needed every cent. Vern started the bidding at $2,500. Silence. He dropped to $2,000. A hand raised half-heartedly, then another. The price climbed slowly, agonizingly, reaching $2,300 before stalling. Jack's heart sank. Vern scanned the crowd, his voice losing its enthusiasm. $2,300 once, twice, sold to bid number 47. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Jack closed his eyes. $2,300. After the auction's commission, he would walk away with barely $2,000. It was not enough. Not nearly enough to keep the bank from starting foreclosure proceedings. He stood to leave, his chest hollow, his vision blurred at the edges. Then Vern's voice cut through the noise again, this time with a note of impatience. "All right, folks, last one of the day. We have a 4-year-old gelding here. Came in with a repossession lot. No papers, no history. He's sound as far as we can tell, but he's been neglected. Let's see what we got." The side gate creaked open, and a horse stumbled into the ring. He was dark bay, almost black, his coat matted with dried mud and burrs. His mane hung in tangles, and his ribs showed faintly beneath the dirt. He moved hesitantly, head low, eyes wide with confusion. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Laughter rippled through the bleachers. "Look at that thing," someone shouted. "Looks like he's been living in a swamp." Another voice chimed in. "I wouldn't take him if you paid me. Feed costs more than he's worth." Wade Garrett leaned back in his seat, grinning. "Vern, you trying to auction off a scarecrow?" The laughter grew louder. Even Vern chuckled uncomfortably into the microphone. "Well, he's had a rough go, that's for sure. Let's start the bidding at 500 and see if anyone's feeling charitable." Silence. The horse stood in the center of the ring, trembling slightly, his ears swiveling toward the noise. Jack watched from the back row, his jaw tight. He recognized the look in the animal's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror that morning. Lost, dismissed, beaten down by circumstances beyond control. Vern sighed. "All right, 200. Anyone?" Nothing. 100. Still nothing. The crowd had moved on, conversations resuming, people gathering their things to leave. The horse shifted his weight, his hooves scraping against the dirt, and for a brief second, his eyes found Jack's. It was not a plea. It was not hope. It was simply recognition. One broken thing seeing another. $50, Vern said flatly, just to move him along. He's gentle, no vices that we know of. $50 and he's yours. Jack's hand moved before his mind caught up. It rose slowly, almost on its own, his fingers spreading as if reaching for something he could not name. The barn fell silent. Heads turned. Vern blinked, momentarily confused. "Bid number?" he called out. Jack's voice came out rougher than he intended. 73. "I'll give you 40. The crowd erupted. Not in cheers, but in disbelief. Wade Garrett twisted in his seat, his grin widening. "Brennan, you serious? You just sold your good mare and now you're buying that?" Frank Dalton's voice cut across the bleachers. "Man's finally lost it completely." Another rancher laughed. "Guess desperation makes you stupid." Riley Patterson, a 17-year-old who had been sitting quietly near the front, turned to look at Jack, her brow furrowed in confusion. She had seen Jack around town, knew his story the way everyone in Timber Ridge knew everyone's story. But this made no sense. Vern hesitated, his hand hovering over the gavel. "Jack, you sure about this?" Jack stood, his legs unsteady, and nodded once. He pulled 2 crumpled $20 bills from his wallet, the last of the cash he had brought for fuel and a meal he now would not eat. "I'm sure." "Sold," Vern declared, the gavel falling with finality. The laughter did not stop. It followed Jack as he made his way down from the bleachers, as he walked across the dirt ring toward the horse, as he reached out a hand that preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The animal flinched away from. People filed past him, shaking their heads, some smirking, others genuinely concerned. Wade Garrett paused at the gate. "You know, Jack, I'd still buy your place. Save you the embarrassment of losing it to the bank. Name your price." Jack did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the horse, his hand extended, waiting. Wade shrugged. "Suit yourself. Enjoy your $40 investment." He walked out, his laughter echoing off the rafters. The barn emptied slowly, the noise fading until only the sound of the horse's breathing remained. Jack stood alone in the ring, his arms still outstretched, his voice low. "Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you." The horse's nostrils flared. testing the air. His body was tense, every muscle coiled as if ready to bolt, but there was nowhere to go. Jack took a step closer, then another, moving with the slow patience of a man who had learned that rushing only broke things further. When his fingers finally touched the tangled mane, the horse shuddered but did not pull away. Jack exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry years of weight. "All right then, let's get you home." Outside, the parking lot had mostly cleared. Jack led the horse toward his trailer, a rusted two-horse rig that had not been used in months. The animal balked at the ramp, his hooves skittering on the metal, but Jack did not force him. He simply stood at the base, his hand on the lead rope, and waited. Minutes passed. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. Finally, the horse took a tentative step forward, then another, and climbed inside. Jack secured the latch and climbed into the truck. His hands shook as he turned the key. He had just spent $40 he could not afford on an animal he did not need. The logical part of his mind screamed that he had made a mistake, that he had let emotion override sense, that this was the act of a desperate man clutching at straws. But as he pulled onto the highway, the trailer creaking behind him, Jack felt something he had not felt in months. Not hope exactly, but the faint echo of purpose. The kind that comes when you stop running from your own brokenness and instead reach out to carry someone else's. The road stretched ahead, winding through the valley toward the Brennan ranch, and for the first time in a long time, Jack was not returning home alone. The mountains loomed dark against the fading sky, their peaks dusted with early snow that glowed faintly in the last light. Jack's truck rumbled along Highway 23, the engine straining slightly on the uphill stretches, the trailer swaying with each curve. Inside the cab, the heater rattled, blowing lukewarm air that barely cut through the cold seeping in around the worn door seals. Jack's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw set as he replayed the scene at the auction in his mind. He could still hear the laughter, still see Wade Garrett's smug grin, still feel the weight of every dismissive glance. $40. He had spent $40 on a horse that nobody wanted, a horse that would need feed, shelter, and care he could barely provide for himself. The rational part of his mind insisted he had made a fool's choice, but every time doubt crept in, he remembered the look in the animal's eyes. That moment of recognition. He knew what it felt like to stand in a room full of people and be seen as worthless. He knew what it meant to be judged, dismissed, and discarded. If no one else would see value in this horse, then he would. Not because it made financial sense, but because some things mattered more than money. The turnoff to Brennan Ranch appeared on the right, marked by a weathered wooden sign that had once read Double B Ranch in proud letters. Now the paint had flaked away, leaving only ghost traces of the words. Jack turned onto the gravel drive, the truck bouncing over potholes he had been meaning to fill for months. The driveway stretched a quarter-mile through a corridor of lodgepole pines before opening into a clearing where the ranch buildings stood. The barn rose against the darkening sky, its red paint faded to the color of rust, one side of the roof sagging slightly where the supports had weakened. The house sat to the left, a two-story log structure with a wraparound porch that had once been Beth's pride. Now the porch steps were loose, the railing cracked, and the windows dark. Jack had stopped lighting more than 1 or 2 rooms years ago. There was no point in heating space he did not use. He pulled the truck around to the barn and killed the engine. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind moving through the pines and the faint creak of the trailer as the horse shifted his weight inside. Jack sat for a moment, his hands still on the wheel, letting exhaustion wash over him. Then he forced himself to move. He climbed out, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked to the back of the trailer. The latch was cold against his fingers as he worked it free and lowered the ramp. Inside, the horse stood with his head low, his body pressed against the far wall. The dim light from the yard illuminated his matted coat, the burrs tangled in his mane, the way his ribs pressed faintly against his sides. Jack stepped inside slowly, his movements deliberate, and reached for the lead rope. "Easy now," he murmured. "We're home." The horse's ears flicked toward his voice, but his body remained tense. Jack waited, giving him time, then gently applied pressure to the rope. The horse resisted at first, his hooves planted, but Jack did not pull harder. He simply stood there, his presence steady, until finally the animal took a cautious step forward. Then another. Together they moved down the ramp, the horse's hooves ringing against the metal, and onto the gravel. The cold air seemed to startle him. His head came up, nostrils flaring as he tested the scents of pine, hay, and earth. His eyes darted across the unfamiliar landscape, the dark bulk of the barn, the distant outline of the mountains, the empty corrals that stretched away into shadow. Jack led him toward the barn, his pace slow, his hand light on the rope. Inside, the barn smelled of old wood, dust, and the faint lingering scent of animals long gone. Jack had sold most of his cattle over the past year, keeping only a handful that grazed the far pasture. The stalls stood empty, their doors hanging open, straw scattered across the floor. Jack had cleaned out one stall earlier that week, though he had not known why at the time. Some part of him must have been preparing for this, even before he understood what he was doing. He led the horse inside and unclipped the lead rope. The animal immediately retreated to the far corner, his body pressed against the wooden wall, his eyes wide and watchful. Jack did not try to approach him again. Instead, he moved quietly, filling a water bucket from the pump outside, scooping oats into a feed bin, spreading fresh straw across the floor. The horse watched every movement, his breathing shallow and quick. Jack hung a lantern on a hook near the door, its soft glow pushing back the darkness. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than the horse. "That's all I got for tonight. Rest if you can." He stepped out of the stall and slid the door closed, leaving a gap so the horse could see out. Then he stood there for a long moment, his hand on the rough wood, listening to the sound of the animal moving restlessly in the straw. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn's north side, and Jack pulled his jacket tighter. He should go inside, start a fire, heat up something to eat, but his feet would not move. He felt anchored to this spot, tethered to the creature on the other side of the door in a way he could not explain. Finally, he forced himself to turn away and walk toward the house. The porch steps creaked under his weight, familiar and worn. Inside, the air was cold enough to see his breath. Jack moved through the dark rooms by memory, lighting a fire in the wood stove, filling the kettle with water, pulling a can of soup from the cabinet. The house felt cavernous around him, every corner filled with ghosts. Beth's knitting basket still sat beside the couch, untouched. Daniel's work gloves hung by the door, stiff with age. Photographs lined the mantel, faces frozen in happier times, smiling at a future that had not turned out the way they had hoped. Jack ate his soup standing at the counter, barely tasting it, his mind still in the barn. He thought about the horse, alone in the dark, frightened and confused. He thought about the $40, money he desperately needed for other things. He thought about Wade Garrett's offer, the easy way out, the chance to walk away from all this with something instead of nothing. But he also thought about the moment in the auction ring when his hand had risen. The moment when he had chosen to see value where no one else did. The moment when he had refused to let another living thing be discarded simply because the world had deemed it worthless. Jack set down his empty bowl and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room. He opened the drawer and pulled out a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and worn. Beth had given it to him years ago, insisting that writing things down helped process grief, helped make sense of chaos. He had tried a few times after she died, but the words had always felt inadequate, too small to contain what he felt. Tonight, though, he opened the notebook to a blank page and picked up a pen. His handwriting was rough, unpracticed, the letters uneven across the lined paper. "Bought a horse today. $40. Everyone laughed. Maybe they're right. Maybe I've lost my mind." But when I looked at him standing there, scared and alone, I saw myself. I saw what it feels like when nobody wants you anymore. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I can even afford to feed him. But I couldn't leave him there. He closed the notebook and set it aside. The fire crackled in the stove, throwing shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the promise of snow. Jack pulled on his jacket again and walked back out into the cold. He crossed the yard to the barn, his breath fogging in the frigid air, and stepped inside. The horse was still awake, standing in the corner of the stall, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lantern. Jack did not enter the stall. He simply sat down on an old wooden crate outside the door, his back against the wall, and let the silence settle around them. Minutes passed. The horse shifted his weight, his hooves rustling in the straw. Jack closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the animal's breathing, the creak of the barn settling, the whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls. He thought about all the things he had lost. His brother, crushed beneath a rolling tractor on a steep hillside 3 autumns ago. His wife, wasted by cancer that had eaten through her faster than any of them had expected. His livelihood, eroded by drought, low cattle prices, and the relentless march of medical bills and debt. He thought about the ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations, now teetering on the edge of foreclosure. He thought about the name Brennan, once spoken with respect in Timber Ridge, now whispered with pity or scorn. And yet here he sat in a cold barn with a horse nobody wanted, and for reasons he could not articulate, he felt less alone than he had in years. Not because the horse offered comfort or companionship, but because in that moment of shared brokenness, there was a kind of honesty. No pretense, no expectations, just 2 beings who had been judged and found wanting, existing in the same space without needing to explain themselves. Jack opened his eyes and looked at the horse through the gap in the stall door. The animal's ears flicked toward him, listening. "You don't have to trust me yet," Jack said quietly. "But I'm not going anywhere." The words hung in the cold air, a promise spoken to a creature that had no reason to believe promises anymore. But Jack meant them. Whatever came next, whatever judgments the town passed, whatever financial ruin loomed on the horizon, he would not abandon this horse. Because if he did, if he gave up on this one fragile chance to choose compassion over practicality, then he would be proving right everyone who said he was finished, that he was broken beyond repair, that there was nothing left in him worth saving. Jack sat on that crate until the lantern burned low and the cold seeped through his jacket into his bones. Only then did he stand, his joints stiff, and make his way back to the house. He climbed the stairs to the bedroom he no longer shared, pulled off his boots, and lay down fully clothed on top of the covers. Sleep came slowly, fitfully, but when it finally took him, he dreamed not of loss, but of a dark bay horse standing in a field of spring grass, his coat gleaming in sunlight, his head held high. The first light of dawn came pale and cold, seeping through the gaps in the curtains like water through cracked stone. Jack woke with a start, his body stiff from sleeping in his clothes, his mind already churning with the weight of what he had done. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the silence of the house, the absence of another person's breathing, the emptiness that had become his constant companion. Then he remembered the horse, and his chest tightened with a mixture of dread and something else he could not quite name. He swung his legs off the bed, his feet finding the cold floorboards, and moved through the morning routine that had become automatic over the years. Coffee grounds measured into the old percolator. Water from the tap that ran rust-colored for the first few seconds. Bread toasted over the wood stove because the electric toaster had broken months ago, and he saw no point in replacing it. Outside, the valley was wrapped in fog that clung to the low places, obscuring the creek and softening the hard edges of the mountains. Jack pulled on his jacket, the same one with the duct-taped elbow, and stepped out into air so cold it burned his lungs. His breath rose in thick clouds as he crossed the yard toward the barn, his boots leaving dark prints in the frost-covered grass. The barn door groaned on its hinges as he pulled it open, and the smell of horse, hay, and old wood washed over him. He had forgotten how alive a barn could feel with an animal inside, how the presence of another breathing creature changed the quality of the air. He approached the stall slowly, not wanting to startle, and peered through the gap in the door. The horse stood in the same corner where he had retreated the night before, his body pressed against the wall, his eyes tracking Jack's every movement. The water bucket sat untouched. The oats remained in the feeder, barely disturbed. Jack's stomach sank. He had seen this before in animals too traumatized or sick to eat, and he knew that a horse who refused food would not last long. He opened the stall door slowly, the hinges creaking, and stepped inside. The horse's ears flattened against his skull, his nostrils flaring, but he did not bolt. There was nowhere to go. Jack stood just inside the door, making himself small, non-threatening, and lowered himself to the floor. The straw was cold and damp beneath him, prickling through his jeans, but he ignored the discomfort. He had learned long ago, back when his father was still alive and the ranch was thriving, that the best way to gentle a frightened animal was not to chase or corner, but to simply exist in the same space without demands. His father used to say that horses could smell intention, could sense whether a human came with force or patience, and that the ones worth keeping were the ones who chose to trust rather than being broken into submission. Jack sat with his legs crossed, his hands resting palm up on his knees, and let the silence settle. Minutes stretched into an hour. His back began to ache from the position, his legs going numb, but he did not move. The horse watched him with unblinking intensity, his breathing gradually slowing, his body losing some of its rigid tension. At one point, the animal shifted his weight, his hooves rustling in the straw, and took a single step away from the wall. It was not progress exactly, but it was movement, and Jack counted it as something. When the sun finally broke through the fog and sent a shaft of light through the gap in the barn wall, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in the air, Jack slowly rose to his feet. His joints protested, his knees cracking audibly, and the horse startled at the sound, pressing back against the wall. Jack moved carefully toward the door, giving the animal as much space as possible, and stepped out of the stall. He slid the door closed but left the top half open so the horse could see into the rest of the barn. The rest of the morning passed in chores that felt both familiar and strange. Jack mucked out the stall in the neighboring space, moving quietly, aware of the horse's eyes following him. He checked the fence line in the near pasture, finding 3 posts that had rotted through and would need replacing before winter truly set in. He inventoried the hay in the loft, counting bales and calculating how long they would last with one additional mouth to feed. The numbers were not encouraging. He had enough to make it through January if he was careful, but February and March would require buying more, and he had no idea where that money would come from. The $40 he had spent on the horse now loomed larger in his mind, not because he regretted the choice, but because it represented a commitment he was not sure he could honor. By midday, the fog had burned off, leaving the valley bright and brittle under a pale sky. Jack was replacing a board on the corral fence when he heard the sound of tires on gravel. He looked up to see a dusty Subaru pulling into the yard, and his jaw tightened. Visitors were rare at the Brennan ranch, and they rarely brought good news. The car door opened, and Riley Patterson stepped out, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, a backpack slung over one shoulder. She was 17, lean and wiry from years of ranch work and 4-H competitions, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from handling animals larger and more unpredictable than herself. Jack had seen her around town, knew her father Tom, who ran a modest cattle operation on the other side of the valley, but they had never spoken more than a few polite words in passing. Riley approached the fence where Jack stood, her boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped a respectful distance away. Her eyes were serious, older than her years. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice clear and direct. "I was at the auction yesterday." Jack set down his hammer, his expression carefully neutral. "That's so." She nodded. "I saw what you did. Buying that horse. The way people laughed." Jack felt heat rise in his face, the shame of it still fresh, but he kept his voice steady. "Well, people talk. Can't stop them." Riley took a step closer, her eyes searching his face. "I'm not here to judge. I'm here to help. I work with the 4-H program, and I've been around horses my whole life. If you need someone to lend a hand, I've got time." Jack opened his mouth to refuse, the instinct to turn away help as automatic as breathing, but something in the girl's expression stopped him. There was no pity there, no condescension, just a straightforward offer from someone who understood that work needed doing. He glanced toward the barn, then back at Riley. "He's not in good shape. Hasn't eaten yet. Skittish. might not even be worth the trouble. Riley followed his gaze toward the barn. Mind if I take a look? Jack hesitated, then nodded. They walked together across the yard, their boots falling into an easy rhythm, and entered the barn. The horse was still standing in the corner of his stall, though his head came up when he heard them approach. Riley moved to the stall door and stood quietly, her hands resting on the top rail, and simply observed. She did not speak for a long time, her eyes taking in the matted coat, the tangles in the mane, the way the horse held his weight. Finally, she said, "He's shut down. Not just scared. He's given up expecting anything good." Jack felt the truth of her words settle over him like a weight. "That's what I figured." Riley turned to look at him. "But he's still here, still standing. That means something." Over the next hour, Riley did not push. She did not try to enter the stall or rush the horse. Instead, she helped Jack with other tasks, carrying water buckets, stacking hay bales, sweeping the barn floor. She talked while she worked, her voice low and steady, telling stories about the horses she had trained, the ones who had come to her fearful or aggressive and eventually learned to trust. Jack found himself listening, not just to the words, but to the underlying message. That patience was not passive. That waiting was its own kind of action. When Riley finally left, promising to return the next day, Jack felt the solitude of the ranch settle over him again, but it was different now, lighter somehow, as if the presence of another person who saw value in what he was trying to do had shifted the weight of his doubt. That evening, Jack carried a bucket of warm water into the barn and set it just inside the stall door. He sat on the crate again, his back against the wall, and pulled out an apple from his coat pocket. He had found it in the back of the refrigerator, slightly wrinkled but still good. He cut it into slices with his pocket knife, the blade moving slowly, deliberately, and the sharp, sweet smell filled the cold air. He placed one slice on the straw near the door, within the horse's reach if he chose to come forward, and kept the rest in his hand. The horse's nostrils flared, his ears pricking forward at the scent. His body remained tense, but his head lowered slightly, curiosity overriding fear for just a moment. Jack did not move. He simply sat, the apple slice resting on his palm, and waited. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the cracks in the barn, and the lantern flame flickered, throwing shadows that danced across the walls. Minutes passed in silence. Then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the horse took a step forward. His hooves moved carefully, testing the ground, his entire body coiled as if ready to spring back at the first sign of danger. Another step, then another. He stopped just short of the apple slice, his muzzle stretching forward, his breath stirring the straw. Jack held perfectly still, barely breathing, his heart hammering in his chest. The horse's lips brushed the apple, tentative and light, and then closed around it. He lifted his head and chewed, the sound loud in the quiet barn, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. It was the smallest of victories, but Jack felt it resonate through his entire body. He allowed himself the ghost of a smile, careful not to make any sudden movements. When the horse had finished the first slice, Jack placed another on the straw, closer this time, and waited again. The process repeated, each slice bringing the horse a fraction nearer, until finally, the animal stood less than 3 feet away. His head lowered, his breathing steady. Jack slowly extended his hand, palm up, the last slice of apple resting on his calloused skin. The horse hesitated, his eyes wide, every muscle in his body quivering with the effort of overcoming instinct. Then, in a moment that felt suspended outside of time, he stretched his neck forward and took the apple directly from Jack's hand. His lips were soft, gentle, brushing against Jack's palm with a touch so light it was almost imagined. Jack felt the warmth of the horse's breath, the faint tickle of whiskers, and something inside his chest cracked open. He blinked hard against the sudden sting in his eyes, his throat tight. When the horse stepped back, returning to his corner, Jack let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He stood slowly, his legs stiff, and left the stall without looking back. Outside, the night had deepened, the stars sharp and bright overhead. Jack walked to the porch and sank down onto the steps, his hands shaking. He pressed his palms against his knees and stared out at the dark shapes of the mountains. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something other than emptiness. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. A flicker of connection. A reminder that he was still capable of reaching out, of offering something, even when he had so little to give. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, slow and steady as the turning of seasons. Jack rose each morning before dawn, the cold biting at his face as he crossed the yard to the barn. Riley appeared most afternoons, her Subaru rattling up the drive, and together they worked in quiet companionship. She never asked about his finances or the foreclosure notices that Jack knew were circulating through the town's rumor mill. She simply showed up, rolled up her sleeves, and did what needed doing. The horse, whom Jack had begun calling Ash in his mind, though he had not spoken the name aloud, slowly began to change. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden transformation, but inch by inch, day by day, the animal's body language shifted. He no longer pressed himself into the corner when Jack entered the stall. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, began to swivel forward with curiosity. He started eating, first just picking at the oats, then consuming full meals. His coat, though still matted and dull, began to take on a faint sheen as his body absorbed the nutrition it had been denied. Jack spent hours brushing him, working through the tangles in his mane with patient fingers, talking in a low voice about nothing in particular. He told Ash about the ranch, about the years when the cattle had been fat and the prices good, about Daniel and the stupid argument they had the day before the accident, about Beth and the way she used to hum while she cooked, about the silence that had filled the house after she was gone. The horse stood still while Jack talked, his eyes half closed, his breathing deep and even. It did not matter that Ash could not understand the words. What mattered was the act of speaking them, of releasing them into the air, of sharing the weight with another living being who did not judge or offer empty platitudes. Riley noticed the change too. One afternoon, as she leaned against the stall door watching Jack work a particularly stubborn knot out of Ash's tail, she said, "He's starting to trust you." Jack did not look up from his work. Maybe, or maybe he's just too tired to fight anymore. Riley shook her head. No, trust and resignation look different. This is trust. Jack paused, his fingers still tangled in the coarse hair, and glanced at the horse's face. Ash's eyes were soft. His expression relaxed in a way it had not been when Jack first brought him home. Maybe Riley was right. Maybe this was what trust looked like when it was still new and fragile, when it could be broken with a single careless act but was choosing, moment by moment, to exist anyway. That evening, after Riley had left and the chores were finished, Jack sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open in front of him. The fire in the wood stove crackled, the only sound in the empty house. He picked up his pen and wrote, "It's been a week. He's eating now, starting to let me touch him without flinching. Riley says it's trust. I don't know if I believe in that anymore, but I know he's not running from me. That's something." He paused, the pen hovering over the paper, then added, "I forgot what it felt like to have something depend on you, to matter to another living thing. I thought that part of me died with Beth. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just waiting." He closed the notebook and stared into the fire, watching the flames consume the wood, turning solid matter into heat and light and ash. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, rattling the windows, but inside, the warmth held. Jack thought about the path that had brought him to this moment, the series of losses and failures that had stripped away everything he thought defined him. And yet here he sat, in a house that was falling apart, on a ranch that was slipping through his fingers, with a horse that nobody wanted, and he felt more present, more alive, than he had in years. It made no sense. It defied every practical consideration. But it was true. The next morning brought the first real snow of the season, fat flakes that fell slow and heavy, blanketing the world in white. Jack woke to the muffled silence that snow brings, the way it swallows sound and softens edges. He dressed quickly, pulling on an extra layer, and headed to the barn. Ash was standing at the stall door, his head over the top rail, watching the snow fall with an expression that seemed almost curious. When he saw Jack approaching, his ears pricked forward, and he nickered softly. It was the first sound Jack had heard him make, a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Jack stopped in his tracks, surprised by the sudden tightness in his throat. "Hey there," he said quietly, his voice rough. "You finally got something to say?" He reached out slowly, and this time, when his hand touched Ash's neck, the horse did not flinch. He leaned into the touch, his eyes closing briefly, and Jack felt the warmth of the animal's body through his glove. They stood like that for a long moment, man and horse, while the snow fell around them and the world felt suspended, held in the fragile space between what had been lost and what might still be found. Jack knew that the challenges ahead had not disappeared. The bank was still circling. The bills were still unpaid. The town still whispered. But in this moment, with his hand on the neck of a horse who had been thrown away and his breath rising in clouds in the cold air, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it. The knowledge that even broken things could find a way to stand, to breathe, to trust again. And if a horse could do it, maybe a man could too. The snow continued to fall throughout the day, accumulating in drifts against the barn and piling high on the fence rails. Jack worked steadily, breaking ice in the water troughs, distributing hay to the handful of cattle still on the property, checking that the barn roof was holding under the weight. Riley did not come, the roads likely too treacherous for her old Subaru, and Jack found himself missing her presence. It had been a long time since he had worked alongside someone, since the silence of labor had been shared rather than solitary. By evening, the storm had intensified, the wind driving the snow sideways, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Jack made one final trip to the barn, fighting through drifts that came up to his knees, to ensure Ash had enough hay and water to last the night. The horse stood calmly in his stall, unbothered by the howling wind, and when Jack reached out to check the latch on the door, Ash pressed his muzzle against Jack's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, almost casual, but it carried the weight of acceptance. Jack stood there, one hand on the horse's neck, and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had done something right. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, one of those early-season blizzards that caught everyone off guard. Jack woke to find snow piled against the front door, blocking it shut, and had to exit through the back to dig his way out. The world had been transformed, every familiar landmark buried or obscured, the fences reduced to suggestions beneath the white expanse. The temperature had dropped severely, the kind of cold that seeped through every layer of clothing and made each breath feel like inhaling knives. Jack's first thought was Ash. He fought his way to the barn, the wind tearing at his coat, his face numb within minutes. Inside, the barn was dim and cold but sheltered from the worst of the storm. Ash was standing calmly in his stall, his body heat having warmed the small space. When he saw Jack, he whinnied, a sound of greeting rather than distress. Jack felt relief flood through him. He quickly checked the horse over, running his hands along the legs, checking hooves, ensuring there were no signs of cold stress or injury. Ash stood patiently, accepting the examination with an ease that would have been unthinkable a week ago. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping Jack on the ranch with no way to get to town and no visitors able to reach him. The isolation was complete, total, the kind that could drive a man mad if he let it. But Jack found that he did not mind. He had Ash. He had work to occupy his hands. And he had the strange peace that came from being forced to exist in the present moment, unable to worry about bills or foreclosures or judgments because survival required all his attention. He spent hours in the barn, not because Ash needed constant tending, but because the company mattered. He brought his notebook and wrote by lantern light while Ash munched hay, the sound of chewing a steady rhythm that filled the silence. He told more stories, his voice growing stronger with each telling, stories about his childhood on this ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about his father's hands, rough and capable, guiding his own smaller ones on the reins, about Daniel, always braver, always faster, always the one their father looked to first, about the weight of being the second son, the one who stayed when Daniel wanted to leave, the one who inherited the ranch not because he was chosen but because he was left. On the third night of the storm, with the wind finally beginning to ease and the snow tapering to occasional flurries, Jack sat on a hay bale with his back against the barn wall. Ash had lain down in the straw, his legs folded beneath him, his eyes half-closed in contentment. Jack watched him, this animal who had been starving and terrified just days ago, now resting peacefully in a warm barn with a full belly. The transformation was not complete. Ash was still too thin, his coat still rough, his past still a mystery. But he was here. He was alive. He was learning to trust again. And in doing so, he was teaching Jack the same lesson. That healing was not a destination but a process. That trust was built in small moments, one choice at a time. That sometimes the most important thing was simply to show up, day after day, even when it seemed pointless. Especially when it seemed pointless. Jack pulled out his notebook and wrote by the flickering lantern light. 3 days snowed in. Just me and Ash. Funny how you can feel less alone with an animal than you did in a house full of people. He doesn't need me to be anything other than present. Doesn't care that I'm broke or that the town thinks I'm crazy. He just needs me to show up. Maybe that's all any of us really need. Someone who shows up. He closed the notebook and leaned his head back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him. The storm had broken something loose inside him, some dam he had built to hold back feeling. Now it flowed through him, not overwhelming but steady, a reminder that he was still alive, still capable of connection, still able to care about something beyond his own survival. Outside, the wind died to a whisper, and the stars began to appear through breaks in the clouds. Inside the barn, a man and a horse rested in shared silence, both of them healing in ways that could not be measured but could be felt. And for now, in this moment, that was enough. When the roads finally cleared and Riley returned to the ranch, she found Jack in the barn, sitting on the floor of Ash's stall while the horse stood nearby, his head lowered, his muzzle resting on Jack's shoulder. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, and smiled. "Looks like something changed while I was gone," she said quietly. Jack looked up, his face creased from days without shaving, his eyes tired but clear. "Yeah," he said simply, "I think it did." Riley stepped closer, moving slowly so as not to startle Ash, and crouched down to Jack's level. She studied the horse, noting the way he stood without tension, the softness in his eyes, the easy way he accepted Jack's presence. "This is good," she said. "Really good. But you know people in town are still talking, right?" Jack nodded. "Let them talk." Riley's expression grew serious. "It's more than talk, Mr. Brennan. My dad heard at the feed store that Wade Garrett has been asking questions about your place. About when the bank might move to foreclose. He's waiting to scoop it up cheap." Jack felt the familiar weight settle back onto his shoulders, the brief peace of the storm-bound days dissolving in the face of reality. "I know," he said quietly. "There's not much I can do about it." Riley stood, her jaw set with determination. "Maybe there is. Maybe there isn't. But either way, you've got people who believe in what you're doing here. You're not as alone as you think." Her words lingered in the cold air of the barn after she left to help with other chores. Jack sat with them, turning them over in his mind. He had spent so long believing he was alone, that his struggles were his burden to bear in isolation, that asking for help was the same as admitting defeat. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe strength was not about bearing everything alone. Maybe it was about accepting that sometimes you needed others, and sometimes others needed you, and that those two truths could coexist without diminishing either. He stood slowly, his joints protesting, and ran his hand along Ash's neck one more time. The horse turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Jack's, and in that gaze Jack saw something he recognized. Not pity, not judgment, just acknowledgement. One survivor seeing another. One wounded soul recognizing that the other was still fighting. Jack took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and made a decision. He would not give up. Not on this ranch. Not on this horse. Not on himself. Whatever came next, whatever challenges the bank or Wade Garrett or the whole damn town threw at him, he would face them. Because he had learned, in the quiet days of the storm, that survival was not just about enduring. It was about choosing every single day to keep standing, to keep reaching out, to keep believing that broken things could be mended, even if the scars remained visible. He left the barn with his shoulders a little straighter, his step a little firmer, and for the first time in months, the future did not feel like a weight he was carrying, but a path he was choosing to walk. The morning came with a clarity that felt almost cruel after the muffled days of the storm. Jack stood at the kitchen window, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone lukewarm in his hands, watching the sun break over the Medicine Bow Range. The light was sharp and clean, illuminating every flaw in the landscape, every broken fence post and sagging roofline that he had been putting off repairing. The snow had melted in patches, leaving the ground mottled and muddy, and the reality he had held at bay during the storm came rushing back with the force of meltwater. He had bills stacked on the counter that he could not pay. He had a mortgage payment due in 2 weeks that he had no way to cover. And he had a horse in his barn that needed continued care, feed that cost money he did not have, and time that should have been spent figuring out how to save what was left of his life. He set down the coffee cup and picked up the envelope that had arrived in yesterday's mail, delivered by Riley, who had stopped at the post office on her way to the ranch. The return address was from First National Bank of Carbon County, and Jack did not need to open it to know what it contained. He had received 3 similar letters over the past 6 months, each one more urgent than the last, each one pushing him closer to the edge of a cliff he could see but could not seem to avoid. His hands shook slightly as he tore open the envelope and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The language was formal, impersonal, the kind of bureaucratic prose designed to distance the writer from the human cost of the words. Notice of default. Failure to remit payment. Foreclosure proceedings to commence. 30 days to bring the account current or vacate the property. Jack read it twice, the words blurring together, and then set it down on the counter next to the others. 30 days. For weeks to come up with $12,000, a sum that might as well have been $12 million for all the chance he had of raising it. He pressed his palms against the counter, his head bowed, and fought against the wave of despair that threatened to pull him under. He had known this was coming, had seen it approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and inexorable. But knowing and facing were different things, and now that the moment was here, he felt the full weight of it pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had homesteaded this land, breaking ground that had never felt a plow, building the original cabin with timber cut from the surrounding forest. His father had expanded it, buying adjacent parcels, building the barn, establishing the herd that had sustained them through good years and bad. Jack had inherited it with the unspoken expectation that he would pass it on to his own children, continuing the legacy. But there were no children. There was no Beth to stand beside him. There was no Daniel to share the load. There was only Jack, alone, failing. He pushed away from the counter and walked outside, needing air, needing space. The cold hit him immediately, but he did not go back for a heavier coat. He welcomed the bite of it, the way it cut through the fog in his head and forced him to focus on something immediate and physical. He walked across the yard toward the barn, his boots squelching in the mud, and found Ash standing at the stall door, his head extended over the rail, ears pricked forward. The horse whinnied when he saw Jack, a sound that was becoming familiar, almost routine, and Jack felt something in his chest loosen slightly. He reached out and ran his hand down the length of Ash's face, feeling the warmth of the animal's skin, the softness of the muzzle, the trust that had been built slowly over the past 2 weeks. "What am I going to do with you?" he murmured, his voice rough. "If I lose this place, I can't take you with me. I've got nowhere to go." Ash huffed softly, his breath warm against Jack's hand, and Jack closed his eyes. He had made a promise to this horse, an unspoken vow that he would not abandon him, that he would provide safety and care. But how could he keep that promise if he lost everything? How could he protect something else when he could not even protect himself? The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see a white pickup truck rolling into the yard, the logo of the county sheriff's department visible on the door. Jack's jaw tightened. He knew who this was before the door even opened. Deputy Mitchell Torres stepped out, a man in his early 40s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen enough of human struggle to approach most situations with a mixture of caution and reluctant sympathy. He was not a bad man, Jack knew, just a man doing his job. But that knowledge did not make his presence any easier to bear. "Mr. Brennan," Torres said, his voice formal but not unkind. He adjusted his hat, a gesture that seemed more nervous than necessary. "Got a minute?" Jack did not move from where he stood beside the barn. "I reckon you're not here for a social call." Torres grimaced slightly. "No, sir, I'm not." He pulled a folded paper from inside his jacket. "I've been asked to deliver this personally. It's from the county livestock inspector's office. There's been a complaint filed." Jack felt his stomach drop. Complaint? About what? Torres unfolded the paper and glanced at it, though Jack suspected he already knew what it said. "Anonymous report claiming you're keeping an animal in neglectful conditions. The inspector, Miss Catherine Pruitt, she's required to investigate any formal complaint. She'll be out here within the week to assess the situation." Jack's hands curled into fists at his sides. Neglect. Who the hell filed a complaint? Torres shook his head. "It's anonymous. Could be anyone. Could be someone who saw the horse at the auction and got the wrong idea. Could be someone with an axe to grind." The deputy's eyes flicked toward the barn, where Ash was still visible at the stall door. "For what it's worth, Mr. Brennan, I've heard what you did at that auction. Heard you paid for a horse nobody else wanted. That doesn't sound like neglect to me. But I'm not the inspector. Pruitt, she's thorough, and she goes by the book. You'll want to have everything in order when she comes." Jack felt the walls closing in. First the foreclosure notice, now this. It was too much, too fast, and he struggled to keep his voice level. "The horse is fed. He's got shelter. He's better off now than he was 2 weeks ago." Torres nodded. "I believe you, but you'll need to prove it. Vet records, condition reports, that sort of thing. And Mr. Brennan," he hesitated, his expression uncomfortable, "Miss Pruitt has the authority to seize an animal if she determines it's being mistreated. I'm not saying she will. I'm just saying be ready to show her that's not the case." The deputy handed over the paper, and Jack took it with hands that felt numb. Torres lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded and returned to his truck. Jack watched him drive away, the white pickup disappearing down the long driveway, and then looked down at the paper in his hands. Official letterhead. Legal language. A date circled in red, 5 days from now, when Catherine Pruitt would arrive to conduct her inspection. Jack crumpled the paper in his fist, anger and frustration boiling over. He wanted to shout, to rage at the unfairness of it all, but there was no one to hear, no one to blame. He was alone with his failures, and now those failures were threatening to take away the one thing that had given him purpose in weeks. He turned and walked into the barn, needing the dimness, the quiet, the presence of the horse who did not judge or demand explanations. Ash watched him enter, his ears swiveling to track the sound of Jack's footsteps, and when Jack sank down onto the hay bale near the stall, the horse moved closer, pressing his body against the rails. Jack reached through the gap and laid his hand on Ash's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of the animal's breathing. "We're in trouble," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." For a long time he sat there, his hand on the horse, his mind racing through options and finding none. He could not afford a vet to come out and provide the documentation Torres had mentioned. He could not prove that Ash was thriving when the horse was still underweight and rough-coated despite the progress they had made. And he could not fight the county if they decided to take Ash away, not without money for a lawyer, not without resources he simply did not have. The morning stretched into afternoon, and Jack remained in the barn, paralyzed by the weight of impossible choices. It was Riley who found him there, her Subaru pulling into the yard just after noon, her footsteps quick and purposeful as she entered the barn. She took one look at his face and knew something had happened. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern. Jack handed her the crumpled paper, and she smoothed it out, her eyes scanning the text. When she looked up, her expression was fierce. "This is garbage. Anyone can see he's doing better." Jack shook his head. Doesn't matter what anyone can see. What matters is what the inspector decides. And if she decides he's being neglected, she can take him. Riley's jaw set in a stubborn line that reminded Jack of her father. Then we make sure she sees he's not being neglected. We get everything documented. We show her the progress. Jack laughed, a bitter sound. With what money, Riley? I can't afford a vet. I can't afford anything. I'm losing this place in 30 days. I've got nothing left to fight with. Riley was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone. My aunt, she said, scrolling through contacts, Dr. Claire Hoffman. She's a vet, works out of Rawlins. She owes my dad a favor. Let me call her. Jack started to protest, but Riley was already dialing. Her voice bright and persuasive as she explained the situation to whoever answered on the other end. She paced while she talked, her free hand gesturing emphatically, and Jack found himself watching with a mixture of hope and disbelief. When she finally hung up, she was smiling. She'll come tomorrow, free of charge. She said any vet worth their license would want to see the work you're doing. Jack felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. You don't owe me anything. Riley looked at him, her young face suddenly serious beyond her years. Because what you did at that auction mattered, Mr. Brennan. You saw something worth saving when everyone else saw trash. That's rare. And if people like you give up, then what's the point of any of it? Her words settled over him, simple and true, and Jack nodded slowly. All right, he said. All right, we'll fight. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Riley helped Jack clean the barn more thoroughly than it had been cleaned in years, sweeping away cobwebs, organizing the tack room, ensuring that every surface looked cared for. They worked on Ash together, brushing his coat until it began to shine, trimming the overgrown edges of his hooves with tools Jack had not used in months, combing through his mane and tail until the tangles were gone. The horse stood patiently through it all, seeming to sense that something important was happening, and by the time the sun began to set, he looked transformed. Not perfect, not yet, but undeniably improved. That night, Jack sat at his kitchen table with his notebook open in front of him. The foreclosure notice lay beside it, a constant reminder of the ticking clock, but he forced himself to focus on what he could control. He wrote down every detail of Ash's care since the day he had brought him home. The amount of feed given, the hours spent grooming, the changes in behavior, the small victories. He documented the storm, the way Ash had weathered it calmly, the trust that had been built. It was not much, but it was something. Evidence that he was trying, that he cared, that this was not neglect but the opposite. Dr. Claire Hoffman arrived the next morning in a dusty Jeep with a veterinary logo on the side. She was a woman in her late 30s, with short blonde hair tucked under a baseball cap and the efficient movements of someone who spent most of their time with animals rather than people. She shook Jack's hand firmly, her grip strong, and got straight to work. Riley had warned him that her aunt was direct, no nonsense, but also fair, and Jack saw the truth of that immediately. Dr. Hoffman examined Ash with thorough precision, checking his teeth, his eyes, his hooves, running her hands along his legs and body, listening to his heart and lungs with a stethoscope. She asked Jack questions in rapid succession. What are you feeding him? How much? How often? When did you start? What was his condition when you got him? Jack answered as best he could, and Riley filled in details when he faltered. The entire examination took over an hour, and by the end, Dr. Hoffman was making notes on a tablet, her expression thoughtful. When she finally stepped back, she looked at Jack with something that might have been approval. Mr. Brennan, this horse was severely malnourished when you acquired him, possibly starved. He shows signs of chronic stress and likely trauma from previous handling. But in the 2 weeks you've had him, he's gained weight, his coat condition is improving, and his behavior indicates he's no longer in a fear state. That's significant progress. Jack felt relief wash over him, so intense it made him dizzy. So he's not being neglected. Dr. Hoffman smiled slightly. Not even close. In fact, I'd say you're doing exactly what he needs. Patience, consistency, basic care. It's not complicated, but it requires commitment. She tapped her tablet. I'll write up a full report for the inspector. It'll state that, in my professional opinion, this animal is receiving appropriate care and showing marked improvement. That should be enough to shut down any complaint. She paused, her expression softening. Riley told me about your situation. About the foreclosure. Jack's jaw tightened. Yeah. Well, that's my problem to deal with. Dr. Hoffman nodded. Maybe. But for what it's worth, what you're doing here matters. Not just for the horse. People pay attention to how we treat the vulnerable things in this world. It says something about who we are. She packed up her equipment and handed Jack a business card. If you need anything else, call me. And Mr. Brennan, don't give up. Sometimes things have a way of working out when you least expect it. She left with a wave, her Jeep kicking up dust as it headed back down the driveway. Jack stood in the yard, the business card in his hand, and felt the weight on his shoulders lighten just slightly. It was not a solution. It did not solve the foreclosure. But it was one less battle to fight, and right now that felt like a victory. Riley stayed through the afternoon, helping with chores and talking about her plans for college, her dreams of studying veterinary medicine like her aunt. Jack listened, finding a strange comfort in her youthful optimism, the way she spoke about the future as something full of possibility rather than dread. When she finally left, promising to return the next day, Jack walked back to the barn and stood at Ash's stall. The horse came to the door immediately, no longer hesitant, and rested his head over the rail. Jack stroked his neck, feeling the warmth, the solidity, the living proof that effort could make a difference. I don't know what's going to happen, he said quietly, but I'm glad you're here, for however long we've got. The words hung in the cold air, a promise and a prayer, and Jack allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe Dr. Hoffman was right. Maybe things had a way of working out, even when it seemed impossible. The days leading up to the inspector's visit passed with agonizing slowness. Jack threw himself into work, repairing fences, cleaning equipment, doing all the small tasks he had been putting off for months. It was partly to make the ranch look presentable, but mostly to keep his mind occupied, to prevent himself from spiraling into the dark places where fear and despair waited. Riley continued to show up every day, her presence a steadying force, and together they transformed the barn into a space that looked cared for, purposeful. Frank Dalton, the skeptical neighbor who had mocked Jack at the auction, appeared unexpectedly one afternoon while Jack was replacing a rotted board on the corral fence. Frank leaned against his own truck, arms crossed, chewing tobacco with the slow deliberation of a man in no hurry. Jack tensed, expecting more mockery, more judgment, but Frank just watched him work for a long time before finally speaking. Heard you got the county sniffing around, Frank said, his voice gruff. Jack did not look up from his work. News travels fast. Frank spat into the dirt. Always does, especially when it's bad news. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Look, Brennan, I've been hard on you. After Daniel, after everything, I blamed you for things that weren't your fault. That wasn't right. Jack's hands stilled on the hammer, surprise freezing him in place. Frank continued, the words coming slowly, reluctantly. That horse you bought. People laughed, myself included. But I've been watching. Seen Riley coming out here. Seen the work you're doing. Takes guts to care about something when your whole world's falling apart. I respect that. He cleared his throat, pushed off from the truck. Anyway, if the inspector gives you trouble, you let me know. I'll vouch for you if it comes to that. Before Jack could respond, Frank climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving Jack standing alone with the weight of an apology he had never expected to receive. The morning Catherine Pruitt was scheduled to arrive, Jack woke before dawn, his stomach churning with anxiety. He dressed carefully in his cleanest clothes, made coffee that he could not drink, and waited. Riley showed up early, bringing with her a folder of documents, Dr. Hoffman's report, photos she had taken of Ash over the past 2 weeks showing his improvement, even a written statement from her father attesting to Jack's character. She's just doing her job, Riley said, seeing the tension in Jack's face. Show her the truth, and she'll see it. The White County vehicle pulled into the yard at exactly 9 o'clock. Catherine Pruitt emerged, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a county-issued jacket and carrying a clipboard. Her face was professionally neutral, giving nothing away, and when she shook Jack's hand, her grip was firm but impersonal. "Mr. Brennan, I'm here to investigate a complaint regarding animal welfare. I'll need to examine the horse and the conditions in which he's kept." Jack nodded, his throat tight. Of course. He led her to the barn, Riley following close behind, and opened the stall door. Ash looked up from where he stood near the hay feeder. His ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than fear. Pruitt entered the stall slowly, her movements professional and measured, and began her examination. She checked everything: the cleanliness of the stall, the quality of the feed, the condition of the water, the horse himself. She ran her hands along his body, checked his hooves, looked at his teeth. She asked questions in a clipped, formal tone, and Jack answered each one truthfully, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Pruitt stepped out of the stall and made notes on her clipboard. She then turned to Jack and Riley, her expression still unreadable. "Mr. Brennan, when this complaint was filed, it alleged that you were keeping an animal in substandard conditions, possibly neglectful or abusive. Based on my examination today, I find no evidence to support those claims." Jack felt his knees weaken with relief, but Pruitt was not finished. "In fact," she continued, her tone softening slightly, "this horse shows clear signs of improvement from what I understand was a severely compromised state when you acquired him. The veterinary report provided by Dr. Hoffman supports this assessment. The stall is clean, the animal is fed and watered appropriately, and his behavior indicates he is not under distress." She lowered her clipboard and looked Jack directly in the eye. "I'll be filing a report that closes this complaint with no findings of neglect. You're doing good work here, Mr. Brennan. Keep it up." She handed him a copy of her preliminary report, shook his hand again, this time with something approaching warmth, and returned to her vehicle. Jack and Riley stood in the yard, watching her drive away, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Riley let out a whoop of triumph, throwing her arms around Jack in an impulsive hug that he was too stunned to return. "We did it," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "We actually did it." Jack nodded slowly, the reality sinking in. They had won this battle. But as Riley pulled away and headed back to her car, chattering excitedly about telling her aunt the news, Jack looked toward the house where the foreclosure notice still sat on the kitchen counter. They had saved Ash from being taken away, but the larger fight was still looming. In less than 3 weeks, the bank would move forward with foreclosure proceedings, and he still had no way to stop it. That night, Jack sat on the porch steps with Ash standing nearby in the corral, the horse having been turned out for the first time since Jack brought him home. Ash moved slowly around the space, exploring, his head lowered as he sniffed at the ground, and Jack watched with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He had given this horse a second chance, a safe place to heal, but he could not guarantee how long that safety would last. The stars came out, sharp and bright in the clear Wyoming sky, and Jack thought about the path that had brought him here. Every loss, every failure, every moment of humiliation had led to the auction, to the decision to raise his hand for a horse nobody wanted. And that decision, foolish as it might have seemed, had become the thing that pulled him back from the edge of complete despair. Ash had needed him, and in needing him, had given Jack a reason to keep getting up each morning. But what happened when he could no longer provide? What happened when the bank took the ranch and he had nowhere to keep Ash, no way to care for him? The questions circled in his mind, unanswerable and relentless, until finally exhaustion pulled him inside to a restless sleep filled with dreams of loss and endings. He did not know, could not know, that the story was far from over, and that the secret Ash carried would soon come to light in ways Jack could never have imagined. For now, he slept, and outside, under the vast Wyoming sky, a dark bay horse grazed peacefully, carrying within him the bloodline of champions and the hope of salvation for the man who had saved his life. The 3rd week of November brought a cold snap that turned the ground hard as iron and made every breath visible in the air. Jack woke each morning to find ice crystals forming on the inside of the windows, delicate patterns that melted when he lit the fire in the wood stove. The days had taken on a strange quality, suspended between the relief of surviving the inspection and the looming certainty of losing everything. He moved through his routines mechanically, feeding Ash, tending to the handful of cattle, chopping wood until his shoulders burned. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on the inevitable. Riley still came most days, though less frequently now that school had resumed after the storm break. She brought news from town, updates on who was saying what, and Jack listened with half an ear, no longer caring much about the opinions of people who had already written him off. It was on a Tuesday morning, gray and bitter, that everything changed. Jack was in the barn, mucking out Ash's stall while the horse stood in the corral outside, when he heard the sound of an unfamiliar vehicle coming up the drive. He straightened, his back protesting, and walked to the barn door to see a silver Mercedes sedan pulling into the yard, incongruous against the backdrop of mud and worn buildings. The car was expensive, the kind that politicians and bankers drove, and Jack felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. The driver's door opened, and a man in his 60s emerged, dressed in wool slacks and a leather jacket that probably cost more than Jack's truck. He was tall, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors despite the expensive clothes. He looked around the property with an assessing eye, then spotted Jack and raised a hand in greeting. Jack set down the pitchfork and walked out to meet him, his boots squelching in the mud, acutely aware of the contrast between his worn work clothes and the stranger's polished appearance. The man extended his hand as Jack approached, his grip firm and his smile professional but not unkind. "Mr. Brennan," he said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone who had spent time in Texas. "My name is Dr. James Whitmore. I'm a bloodline specialist and registry consultant for the American Quarter Horse Association. I've driven up from Colorado, and I was hoping you might have a few minutes to talk." Jack shook his hand, confused. "I'm not sure what you're wanting to talk about, but I've got time." Whitmore glanced toward the corral where Ash stood, his head raised, watching the stranger with alert curiosity. "Is that the horse you purchased at the Timber Ridge auction 3 weeks ago?" Jack followed his gaze. "That's Ash, yes." "Why?" Whitmore's expression shifted, something like excitement flickering behind his professional demeanor. "Because, Mr. Brennan, I believe that horse may be worth considerably more than the $40 you paid for him." Jack felt the world tilt slightly. "What are you talking about?" Whitmore gestured toward the corral. "May I take a closer look?" Jack nodded, still trying to process what he was hearing, and led the way. Ash had moved to the far side of the corral but did not shy away as they approached. Whitmore stood at the fence, his eyes moving over the horse with an intensity that suggested he was seeing things Jack could not. After a long moment, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through several images before holding one up for Jack to see. "This is a photograph of a stallion named Ashford's King," he said. "He was one of the finest cutting horses of his generation. Won multiple national championships, produced offspring that sold for 6 figures. He was owned by a rancher in eastern Montana who died 2 years ago. The estate went into probate, became a mess of legal disputes, and the horses were eventually dispersed through various channels, some of them less than official." Jack stared at the image on the phone, then at Ash, and felt his heart begin to pound. "You think that's his offspring?" Whitmore nodded slowly. "I think there's a strong possibility. The conformation matches. The markings are consistent. And there was a colt born from Ashford's King's last breeding season that disappeared during the estate liquidation. No papers, no registration, just gone. I've been tracking leads for months, trying to locate him for the new owner of the bloodline rights. When I heard about a dark bay gelding showing up at a livestock auction in this area with no history, I had to investigate." Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "But he's a gelding. He's been castrated. Doesn't that make him worthless for breeding?" Whitmore shook his head. "It makes him worthless for breeding, yes, but not worthless overall. If this is who I think he is, he carries documented champion bloodlines. With the right training, he could still compete, still represent the legacy of his sire. More importantly, proving his identity would resolve questions about the estate and potentially unlock significant value in related claims." He paused, meeting Jack's eyes. "I need to arrange for a DNA test to confirm, but if I'm right, Mr. Brennan, This horse is worth at least $50,000. Maybe more to the right buyer. The number hit Jack like a physical blow. $50,000. It was more money than he had seen in years, more than enough to pay off the bank, to save the ranch, to buy feed and make repairs and maybe, finally, breathe without the constant weight of financial ruin pressing down on him. He looked at Ash, standing calmly in the corral, unaware that his entire identity might be something other than what Jack had assumed, and felt a wave of emotions too complex to name. "Why are you telling me this?" Jack asked quietly. "If you're trying to locate him for someone else, why not just take him?" Whitmore smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Because legally you purchased him in a legitimate transaction. The auction house transferred ownership. Until someone can prove otherwise with documentation, he's yours. And more than that," he looked at the corral, at the clean stall visible through the barn door, at the obvious care that had been given. "You've done right by him. You bought him when no one else would. You fed him, cared for him, brought him back from the edge. That matters." He pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to Jack. "I'd like to arrange for a vet to come out and take a DNA sample. It'll take about 2 weeks to get results from the lab. If it confirms what I suspect, we'll need to have some conversations about what happens next." "But Mr. Brennan," he met Jack's eyes with an earnestness that felt real. "Whatever happens, you've earned something here. Don't let anyone tell you different." Whitmore left shortly after, his Mercedes kicking up dust as it disappeared down the drive, and Jack stood alone in the yard, the business card clutched in his hand, his mind reeling. $50,000. The words kept repeating, impossible and tantalizing, like a dream he was afraid to believe in. He walked slowly to the corral and leaned against the fence. Ash ambled over, his gait still carrying the slight awkwardness of his rough past but growing steadier each day, and pushed his muzzle against Jack's chest. Jack wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, pressing his face against the coarse mane, and felt tears burn behind his eyes. "Who are you?" he whispered. The horse, of course, had no answer, but Jack held on anyway, grounding himself in the physical reality of muscle and warmth and breath. Whatever the DNA test revealed, whatever value Ash might or might not carry, Jack knew with sudden clarity that the horse had already given him something priceless. Purpose. Hope. A reason to keep fighting when everything else said to give up. Riley arrived that afternoon and Jack told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. She listened with wide eyes, her expression cycling through disbelief, excitement, and fierce joy. "This is it," she said, grabbing his arm. "This is how you save the ranch. Don't you see? This is the miracle." Jack wanted to believe her, but years of disappointment had taught him caution. "We don't know anything for sure yet," he said. "Could be the DNA doesn't match. Could be Whitmore's wrong." Riley shook her head stubbornly. "He's not wrong. I can feel it. And even if he is, it doesn't change what you've done. You saved this horse. That's worth something all on its own." Her faith, unshakable and bright, made Jack want to believe. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with the business card in front of him and his notebook open. He wrote, "A man came today and said Ash might be worth $50,000. I don't know if it's true. Part of me is afraid to hope. But if it is true, if this horse really does carry champion blood, then maybe all of this, the humiliation at the auction, the struggle, the fear, maybe it meant something. Maybe broken things really can carry unexpected value." The DNA test was conducted 3 days later by Dr. Hoffman, who drove out personally and seemed as invested in the outcome as anyone. She drew blood from Ash's neck with practiced efficiency, filled out the requisite forms, and sent the sample off to a specialized lab in Kentucky that Whitmore had arranged. "Now we wait," she said, packing up her equipment. Jack nodded, trying to quell the nervous energy that had been building in his chest. Waiting had never been his strength, but he had no choice. The results would take 2 weeks, Whitmore had said, maybe longer depending on the lab's backlog. 2 weeks during which Jack would have to continue living in limbo, not knowing if salvation was coming, or if this was just another cruel twist in a story that seemed determined to break him. He threw himself into work, pushing his body harder than was wise, repairing every broken thing he could find on the property. He fixed the sagging barn roof, replaced rotted boards in the corral, even tackled the loose porch steps that had been dangerous for months. Riley helped when she could, and even Frank Dalton appeared one afternoon with a truckload of spare lumber and an offer to help shore up the fence line. The community, it seemed, had begun to shift its perception. The story of Jack buying the worthless horse had evolved in the telling, becoming less about foolishness and more about compassion. People nodded at him in town now instead of looking away. The woman at the feed store extended him credit without being asked. Small gestures, but they added up, creating a fragile net of support that Jack had not felt in years. Wade Garrett, however, remained a dark presence on the periphery. Jack heard through Riley that Wade had been asking pointed questions about when the bank would finalize the foreclosure, that he had already drawn up plans for what he would do with the Brennan property once he acquired it. The knowledge sat heavy in Jack's gut, a reminder that even if the DNA test came back positive, there were still people waiting for him to fail, still forces aligned against his survival. The days passed with agonizing slowness, each one bringing Jack closer to the foreclosure deadline. He had less than a week left when Whitmore called. Jack was in the barn when his phone rang, the ancient flip model he had refused to upgrade because it still worked. He saw the Colorado number and his heart lurched. He answered, his voice rougher than intended. "This is Brennan." "Mr. Brennan," Whitmore's voice came through clear and excited. "I just got off the phone with the lab. The results are in." Jack's legs suddenly felt weak, and he sat down hard on a hay bale. "And?" Whitmore paused, and in that moment of silence, Jack felt the entire trajectory of his future hanging in balance. "It's a match," Whitmore said, and Jack could hear the smile in his voice. "Ash is confirmed to be a direct offspring of Ashford's king. His registered name would have been Ashford's legacy. Mr. Brennan, you own a horse with documented champion bloodlines." Jack closed his eyes, the phone pressed to his ear, and felt the weight of months, years press down and then suddenly lift. The relief was so profound it was almost painful. "What happens now?" he managed to ask. "Now," Whitmore said, "we have some decisions to make. I represent several parties who would be interested in purchasing him. I can facilitate those conversations. Or, if you prefer to keep him, we can discuss training options, future prospects. But first, we need to settle the question of ownership definitively. There are still legal complexities with the estate, but given that you purchased him through legitimate channels and no one contested it at the time, your claim is strong. I'm prepared to help you navigate that process." Jack opened his eyes and looked across the barn to where Ash stood in his stall, head lowered peacefully, utterly unaware of the storm of revelation swirling around him. "I need time to think," Jack said. Whitmore's voice was understanding. "Of course. Take the time you need. But Mr. Brennan, the foreclosure, I know about your situation. If you're interested in selling, I have a buyer who would pay $60,000 cash immediately. It would solve your immediate problems. $60,000. More than enough to pay off the bank with money left over to make repairs, restock the herd, start rebuilding." It was the answer to every prayer Jack had whispered into the darkness over the past year. And yet, as he looked at Ash, he felt something twist in his chest. This horse had trusted him, had chosen to stay when given the chance to leave, had been the one living thing that made Jack feel less alone. Could he really sell that? Could he trade that connection for money, even money he desperately needed? "I'll call you back," Jack said, and ended the call before Whitmore could respond. He sat in the silence of the barn, his head in his hands, and tried to think through the fog of emotion. The logical choice was obvious. Sell the horse, save the ranch, move forward. Ash would go to a good home, would be trained and cared for by professionals who could give him opportunities Jack never could. It made sense. It was practical. It was the smart choice, but it felt like betrayal. Riley found him there an hour later, still sitting on the hay bale, staring at nothing. She took one look at his face and knew. "The results came back," she said quietly. "It's not a question." Jack nodded. "He's worth $60,000. Maybe more." Riley sat down beside him, her shoulder touching his. "So you can save the ranch." Jack's voice came out hollow. "I can save the ranch if I sell him." Riley was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" Jack laughed, a broken sound. "I don't know. I should sell him. It's the logical choice. It solves everything. But Riley, he turned to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed. I made him a promise. I told him I wouldn't abandon him. If I sell him, even to a good home, isn't that exactly what I'm doing? Riley reached over and took his hand, her grip strong. Mr. Brennan, she said, her voice gentle. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let go. If selling Ash means you can keep the ranch, means you can help other animals in the future, means you survive to fight another day, that's not betrayal. That's sacrifice. And sacrifice born from love is the hardest kind. Her words settled over him, wise beyond her years, and Jack felt the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen. She was right. He knew she was right. Keeping Ash out of stubborn attachment while losing everything else would serve no one, least of all the horse. If he sold Ash, he could save the ranch that had been in his family for generations. He could honor the legacy of his father and grandfather. He could create a place where, maybe someday, he could help other animals, other broken things that needed a second chance. It was the right choice, but that did not make it hurt any less. That night, Jack called Whitmore and told him to proceed with the sale. The buyer, a retired cutting horse trainer in Colorado who wanted to work with Ash and eventually compete with him, was thrilled. The money would be transferred within 3 days, and arrangements would be made to transport Ash at the end of the week. Jack hung up the phone and immediately walked out to the barn. Ash was lying down in the straw, his legs tucked beneath him, looking peaceful and content. When he saw Jack, he lifted his head and nickered softly. Jack opened the stall door and sat down beside him, his back against the wall, and laid his hand on the horse's shoulder. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I wish there was another way. Ash turned his head and rested his muzzle on Jack's knee, a gesture of trust so complete that Jack had to close his eyes against the tears. They sat like that for hours, man and horse, in the dim lantern light, and Jack told him everything. About Beth and Daniel and Noah, about the years of loss, about the auction and the laughter and the choice to buy a horse nobody wanted. About the hope Ash had given him when he had none left. About the impossible situation and the terrible choice and the knowledge that sometimes love meant letting go. Ash listened, his breathing slow and steady, and when Jack finally stood to leave, the horse rose too, following him to the stall door as if unwilling to let the moment end. Jack pressed his forehead against Ash's and whispered one last promise. I won't forget you, I swear. Wherever you go, whatever happens, you'll always matter. You saved me as much as I saved you. The day Ash was scheduled to leave dawned clear and cold, the sky a brittle blue that seemed to mock the heaviness in Jack's chest. The transport trailer arrived at noon, a professional rig with cushioned stalls and careful handlers. The buyer, a man named Michael Carson, had come personally, wanting to meet Jack and see where Ash had been living. He was in his late 50s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime spent with horses. He walked through the barn with quiet respect, noting the clean stall, the carefully maintained equipment, the obvious care that had been given. You did good work here, Carson said, his voice sincere. This horse was lucky to find you. Jack could not speak past the lump in his throat, so he only nodded. Riley was there, and Dr. Hoffman, and even Frank Dalton, all of them gathered to bear witness to the goodbye. Together, they led Ash out of the barn and toward the trailer. The horse walked calmly, trusting, unaware that this was farewell. At the base of the ramp, Jack stopped. Ash turned to look at him, ears forward, and Jack ran his hand down the length of the horse's face one last time. You're going to have a good life, he said, his voice breaking. Better than I could give you. Carson will take care of you. You'll get to do what you were meant to do. Ash huffed softly and leaned into Jack's touch, and Jack had to turn away, his vision blurring. Riley stepped forward and gently took the lead rope, guiding Ash up the ramp while Jack stood frozen, unable to watch and unable to look away. The trailer door closed with a hollow thud, and Carson shook Jack's hand one more time before climbing into the cab. The engine started, and the rig pulled slowly out of the yard, carrying Ash away toward a future that did not include the broken-down ranch or the man who had saved him. Jack stood in the empty yard, his hands hanging useless at his sides, and felt the loss open up inside him like a chasm. Riley came to stand beside him, her own eyes wet. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. Jack nodded, though he did not believe it yet. He would, eventually. But right now, all he felt was the absence. The silence where Ash's nickering should have been. The empty stall that would take months to stop looking at, expecting to see a dark bay horse standing there. The money arrived in Jack's account the next day, transferred electronically, and he immediately paid off the bank. The foreclosure proceedings were halted, the notices withdrawn, the threat lifted. Harold Simmons, the banker, called personally to confirm the account was current and to express surprise at the sudden reversal of fortune. Jack said nothing about Ash, about the secret the horse had carried, about the sacrifice that had saved everything. He simply thanked the man and hung up. Over the following weeks, Jack used the remaining money to make repairs, to buy feed, to slowly restore the ranch to something approaching functional. Wade Garrett, thwarted in his plans to acquire the property, stopped coming around, his interest cooled by Jack's sudden solvency. The town buzzed with speculation about where the money had come from, theories ranging from a secret inheritance to selling off land. But Jack deflected all questions with a simple statement. "I sold something valuable." That was all anyone needed to know. Riley continued to visit, helping with the work, and slowly, life on the Brennan ranch began to resemble something other than survival. Jack bought 3 heifers and a young bull, the start of rebuilding his herd. He repaired the irrigation system and prepared the fields for spring planting. He fixed the porch and painted the barn, covering the faded red with a fresh coat that gleamed in the sun. He was moving forward because that was what you did. You survived. You rebuilt. You kept going. But every evening, when the work was done and the light faded from the sky, Jack walked out to the empty corral and stood where Ash used to graze. The absence was a physical ache, a reminder of the cost of survival, and some nights it was almost unbearable. Was on one of those evenings, 6 weeks after Ash had left, that Jack's phone rang. He did not recognize the number but answered anyway. "Mr. Brennan, this is Michael Carson." Jack's heart clenched. "Is something wrong with Ash?" No, Carson said quickly. "He's doing wonderfully, better than I could have hoped. He's taken to training like he was born for it." "Mr. Brennan, I'm calling because I wanted you to know something. We entered him in a small local competition last weekend, just to see how he'd handle the pressure." Jack felt his chest tighten. "How did he do?" Carson's voice was filled with unmistakable pride. "He won, Mr. Brennan. First place in his division. He was brilliant. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. And the whole time I kept thinking about you, about how you saw value in him when he was starving and covered in mud. You gave him the foundation for this. You saved his life. I thought you should know what came of that." Jack could not speak. His throat had closed completely, tears streaming down his face, and he stood in the twilight with the phone pressed to his ear and felt something break open inside him. Not grief this time, but something else. Joy, perhaps, or vindication. The knowledge that the choice, as painful as it had been, had led to something good. "Thank you," he finally managed to say. Carson's voice was gentle. "He misses you, I think. He looks toward the gate sometimes like he's waiting for someone. I know it doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to know that too. I'll take care of him, Mr. Brennan. For as long as he's with me, he'll be valued." The call ended, and Jack stood in the gathering darkness, his face wet, his heart full of a complex mixture of loss and gratitude. Ash was thriving. He was doing what he was meant to do, fulfilling the potential that had been hidden beneath neglect and trauma. And Jack, in letting him go, had made that possible. Spring came early that year, the snow melting to reveal green grass pushing through the mud. Jack planted hay fields and watched his small herd grow. Riley graduated high school and prepared to leave for college in the fall, but she promised to return during breaks. Frank Dalton became an unexpected friend, stopping by occasionally to help with heavy work and staying for coffee that turned into long conversations about loss and second chances. The ranch, slowly, began to feel less like a burden and more like a home again. Jack still thought about Ash every day. He still walked to the corral and imagined the horse standing there, head raised, ears forward. But the ache had softened into something gentler, a bittersweet remembrance of the time they had shared and the ways they had saved each other. He started writing more in his notebook, not just recording events but reflecting on them, trying to make sense of the journey. One entry, written on a warm May evening with the windows open and the smell of grass drifting through the house, read, "I thought the point was to keep him. I thought if I let him go it would mean I failed. But maybe the point was never about keeping. Maybe it was about choosing to see value when no one else did. About offering care without expectation of return. About learning that love sometimes means making the hardest choice, the one that costs you everything but gives someone else a chance to fly." News reached him periodically through Carson, who sent updates and photos. Ash winning another competition. Ash being featured in a horse magazine. Ash becoming something of a local celebrity in the cutting horse world. His story of rescue and redemption resonating with people who had their own struggles. Each update brought Jack a measure of peace, confirmation that he had made the right choice, that the sacrifice had mattered. Then, on a blazing afternoon in July, a silver Mercedes pulled into his yard for the second time. Dr. Whitmore emerged, looking as polished as ever. But this time he was not alone. Michael Carson climbed out of the passenger seat, and from the back of a horse trailer that Jack had not noticed at first, two figures emerged leading a dark bay horse. Jack's heart stopped. Ash stood at the base of the trailer ramp, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, his body filled out and powerful, every inch the champion he had always been beneath the neglect. But it was his eyes that Jack recognized, the same steady, trusting gaze that had followed him through months of healing. "Mr. Brennan," Carson called, walking toward him with a smile. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced." Jack could not move, his eyes locked on Ash, who had spotted him and was pulling toward him with clear intent. Carson laughed and released the lead rope. Ash trotted across the yard, his gait strong and even, and came to a stop directly in front of Jack. He lowered his head, pushing his muzzle against Jack's chest in the same gesture he had used months ago, and Jack wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, his entire body shaking. "Why is he here?" Jack asked, his voice muffled against Ash's mane. Carson came to stand beside them, his expression warm. "Because he's home, Mr. Brennan. I've been working with him for months, and he's everything I hoped for and more. But the thing about horses, especially ones like Ash, is they remember. They know where they belong." He paused, glancing at Whitmore, who nodded encouragingly. "I don't need to own him to train him. I can come here, work with him here, prepare him for competitions from this ranch. If you're willing." Jack pulled back, looking between Carson, Whitmore, and Ash in disbelief. "I don't understand." Whitmore stepped forward, his professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. "Mr. Brennan, when you sold Ash, you saved your ranch. But you also proved something important, that you were capable of putting his welfare above your own needs. Michael and I have been discussing this for weeks, and we've come to an agreement. Ash will remain legally yours, but Michael will handle his training and competition career. Any winnings will be split, and you'll maintain ownership of a horse who is already gaining recognition in the cutting horse world. It's unconventional, but it works for everyone involved, especially Ash." Jack looked down at the horse, who was watching him with calm contentment, and felt tears stream unchecked down his face. Riley's Subaru came tearing up the drive, and she tumbled out, having apparently been called by Carson to be present for the reunion. She ran toward them, laughing and crying at the same time, and threw her arms around both Jack and Ash. "He came back," she said unnecessarily, joyfully. "He came home." That evening, after Carson and Whitmore had left with promises to return in a week to begin the training schedule, after Riley had gone home still grinning from ear to ear, Jack stood in the barn with Ash in his old stall. The horse was settled, munching hay as if he had never left, and Jack leaned against the door, watching him with a sense of completeness he had not felt in years. He pulled out his notebook and wrote his final entry. "Today he came home. I thought I had to choose between saving him and saving myself, but it turns out I didn't. Sometimes the world surprises you. Sometimes broken things find their way back to where they belong. I bought him for $40 when no one else wanted him, and he turned out to be worth more than I ever imagined. Not just in money, though that mattered, but in what he taught me. That value isn't always visible. That caring for something costs, but it's worth the price. That even when everything seems lost, there's still room for miracles if you're willing to keep showing up. The stars came out over the Medicine Bow Range, bright and cold and infinite. Inside the barn, a lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the straw. A man sat beside a stall where a champion horse rested, both of them scarred by the past, both of them healing, both of them proof that sometimes the most broken things carry the most unexpected value. And in that small circle of light, surrounded by darkness, there was hope. Not the naive kind that ignores reality, but the hard-won kind that survives despite it. The kind that says, we made it through, we're still here, and tomorrow we'll keep going. Together. Jack closed the notebook and set it aside. He reached through the stall rails and laid his hand on Ash's shoulder, feeling the warmth, the strength, the steady rhythm of breath that matched his own. Outside, the valley slept, and the future waited, uncertain but no longer terrifying, because he was not facing it alone anymore. He never had been. From the moment he raised his hand at that auction, from the moment he chose compassion over practicality, he had been connected to something larger than himself. And that connection, fragile as it sometimes felt, had been strong enough to carry them both through the darkest times to this moment of unexpected grace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.